Thanks everyone. So I've thrown together a bit of a piecemeal presentation for tonight, not because it was all prepared at the last minute, but because when I was thinking about what a group of ATA members might want to discuss about community renewable energy, it struck me that it's probably quite a different angle to what we take when talking to the general public about it. And so what I think might be a good idea is if I've only got 12 slides that are just some talking points. I'd like to get about halfway through them and then sort of stop and have a chat about something and then keep going. But I want to take questions at any time. And if the questions are about a topic or can you hurry up, we get it, or whatever, and just be open. Some of you here have had the pleasure of hearing me rabbit on for hours on end as students here at Swinburne, so understand that sometimes you need to do that, but still won't be offended. I don't need to tell you all much about ATA because you probably already know it, but there's a bit about ATA. I'm sure you could add another many bullet points to that. The point that I'm involved with out of those is really largely that second last point, and I'll talk a bit about what our team does because not so many people are aware of the ATA Policy and Projects team. That's partly because we're policy wonks who rarely escape offices and meetings. We also do projects work, and here's a bit of what we actually do. So the team is myself and at the moment one other person being employed for some of you know. Soon to be two other people when we get a new recruit starting in a couple of weeks, which is very exciting. He actually comes from Memery, the Australian energy market operator, and has a background with number crunching and spreadsheets that would be the envy of the most spreadsheet-obsessed ATA member, I reckon. So we're looking forward to getting his experience on board. So what we do is we do a few things. But about half of our time in the Energy Policy and Projects team is devoted to delivering one project which we're funded for by the Consumer Advocacy Panel, and that's to advocate for energy consumers, including and especially ATA members, in the national energy market, in energy market policy. Now, it's quite a challenging space as an energy consumer advocate. There's only about 20 energy consumer advocates across Australia, and unlike all the people in industry who do their advocacy, who all have their narrow little area that they focus on, the energy consumer advocates have to be across everything. So it's a really challenging space, but it's a lot of fun to get exposed to a lot of areas and policies. So the main sort of areas that we give advice on relate to sustainable energy and technology. The second point there is a really big one for us, smart networks and demand-side participation. I won't go into detail about what those are now, but feel free to ask questions about them. In terms of professional services, we do project feasibility studies and advice and financial modelling for all sorts of clients, for government, for some private clients as well, and some in between. And recently a feature of some of our projects has been a lot of support for community renewable projects. In terms of those projects themselves, it's a really interesting space, and it's burgeoning. So there's more than 50 organisations around Australia at the moment who are at different stages of developing community renewable energy projects, and that's pretty exciting. We advocate for them as consumers as part of our energy consumer advocacy that I talked about before. We also, sometimes as a paid fee service, we provide technical and energy market expertise for them, and we also do that gratis sometimes, especially if the group becomes an ATA member, which entitles anyone to use our staff for services, of course. We're members of a group called the Coalition for Community Energy, which is a really energetic group that's just been formed in the last couple of years. There's a few key people behind it. It's national, so there's organisations involved, including Institute for Sustainable Futures in Sydney, including a lot of those 50 groups that are actually directly interested in advocating for community energy. We're also at the moment, there's not a lot of details to share, I'm not being secretive, but there's really not much to share at this stage. We're looking at a potential ATA community renewable energy project, be that working with another party to brand one of their projects with ATA, or to actually just say, look, we'll just do our own thing with members. So that's just space to watch. And of course, when it comes to community energy, ATA members are kind of at the cutting edge, and as I've said there, I was going to say the coal face, but that's probably not really appropriate for ATA members. I haven't had time to come up with a better analogy that involves things that aren't coal. So, you know, I mean, we're talking about community energy, and I will touch on what community renewable energy projects are, but I was contemplating just today that some of you will be familiar with Hepburn, which is considered, the Hepburn Wind Project is considered to be the first community wind project. Well, actually the first cooperatively owned wind energy project in Australia was an ATA-related project about 20 odd years ago, the Brimley wind turbine down outside Geelong. So really, ATA members have been at the forefront of this, and it's now becoming an interest of the broader community. So any questions there on what we do before I just talk a bit more about what community renewable energy is? Okay, so because of the time limitations, I decided not to use the normal sort of 15-slide, here's the energy basics stuff that I would normally present to the general public. I've actually got one slide just outlining two of the common models for community energy. And I figured at this point, if anyone's got questions as we go through this, we can. Then after this, I wanted to talk about community energy in the context of some of the stuff that we're dealing with, so you can understand some of the changes that are underway that we're advocating for to actually make it more of a reality. Because there's a lot of challenges that are faced by community energy in making these projects a reality. So community energy is actually really broad. It's whatever communities want to do and get involved with as groups. And community is a word in itself. It's defined by the people who are in communities. It could be a geographic community, it could be a community defined by having a common interest. And in the context of community energy, that includes renewable energy, that includes bulk buy schemes for not just renewables, but for energy efficiency programs. That includes communities that are interested in looking at ways to store energy, not even just generating it, but storing it in batteries or with other methods. Communities that are looking at how they can try and benefit from reducing peak demand on the grid and be rewarded in some way for that. So it is a lot broader than just renewables, but the main focus that I'll use for this presentation, so that you can all go home at 10 p.m, is focusing on a couple of particular models for specifically community renewable energy projects. First one, some of you will be familiar with, and it's basically a community-owned wind farm. So a number of wind turbines. The classic example is Hepburn Wind, which is two. That's two megawatt wind turbines located in central Victoria. There's another one in Denmark in WA. That's Denmark in Western Australia as opposed to the other Denmark, which has a lot more wind in Europe, a lot more wind turbines. Now, it's a pretty simple arrangement to describe from the top down, and that is you have a few hundred or a few thousand shareholders. They invest in this project, it's worth a few $1 million. It gets returns. It's a wind farm, so it sells energy to the grid. Some of the returns that it gets are in the form of selling the electricity, and some in the form of the LGCs. They used to be called RECs, or Renewable Energy Certificates, which are sold, and they comprise the actual renewable energy value of what's sold to the grid. And they go towards meeting the renewable energy target. They also go towards people's green power. People buy green power. The shareholders of the project, who are the owners, they receive revenue in the form of dividends for shares. Now, there's all other sorts of permutations of that, but that's the basic model. That's the Hepburn model, and it's a common one for the wholesale arrangement. Now, those generators are effectively competing with other wind farms, competing with coal-fired power stations, competing to sell wholesale volumes of energy on the energy market. The second version, though, of community renewable energy projects that's becoming quite common in terms of interest is the community-owned solar model, which is usually not where you've got a big solar farm that's selling directly onto the grid for wholesale. It's actually a similar ownership structure often, so you've got multiple shareholders, except rather than being a solar farm which is selling into the wholesale market like a big wind farm, it will be on the roof of a large energy user. It could be a public energy user like a library or a market, as in the case of one of the projects I've noted here, which is the live project which is proposed for the South Melbourne market. It could be located on a commercial or industrial site. Key thing is that being large-scale solar, or being medium-scale solar, I should say, and being located behind the customer's meter, they can sell energy to that customer, and it's worth a lot more than selling energy onto the wholesale market. So, whereas the wind farm model, which is the Hepburn model, it might get, I don't know, let's say 10 or 11 cents per kilowatt hour for the energy that it sells, which is the combined value of the electricity and the RECs. The combined value for the community-owned PV that's located behind an electricity meter might be 20 or 25 cents per kilowatt hour, because it's offsetting retail consumption at that site. And that's a huge difference, obviously, in terms of the return and the value of the energy.
What scale does it need to be?
They're usually in the tens or hundreds of kilowatts to be effective. It really depends on the size of the site. And it's a really good question too. So large energy users pay less for energy. So there's this sweet spot in terms of the scale of solar, where if you're a commercial and industrial site, you might only pay 10 cents a kilowatt hour for the energy that you get from the grid, especially if you've got a relatively flat load that's not very peaky. So if you're investing in a community-owned solar project behind a meter on one of those sites, you won't get as good return as if you're selling to a, say, medium-sized energy user. And that might limit the size of the PV array to tens or hundreds of kilowatts. So another feature of the model for community-owned projects is that you can have an investment body, which is a bunch of shareholders and community, who can actually invest in more than one system. Because there's no reason, because it's solar, you need to limit it to one particular solar farm somewhere. With wind as a technology, one reason that bigger is better for wind energy is because that's how the economics of scale for wind turbines work. When you double the rotor diameter of your turbine, you increase by a factor of 4 the amount of energy that you can harness from that wind turbine. That's why you have wind farms with big wind turbines on them, because every time you double the size of the rotor diameter, you get more energy produced. You don't need to do that with solar though, where you don't have the same doubling. Therefore, you don't get the reverse effect, which is with a wind farm, when you halve the size of your wind turbine, you get 1/4 of the energy out of it. So if you take the solar array, if you say, okay, we've got the investors here, we want to invest in a megawatt of solar, there's no reason it all has to go on one roof. You can put 50 kilowatts on the library, 200 kilowatts over here on a commercial industrial user. It can be in a number of locations. So now, that's not to say that you can't have a reversal of the technology. You can have a solar model in a wholesale market arrangement, which is where the energy is sold for wholesale prices. Based on the current economics of solar though, you won't make any money, so there's no point. And it's unlikely to change. So that's why the solar model is usually in that second one, where you're selling behind the meter. Yep.
I was just trying to visualise. I think you were saying for the second type, where you're sharing energy separate from the retailer. I take it you have to be all on the same side of 1 meter, and I have trouble visualising a community that has one common meter.
Right. So I probably didn't explain that as well as I could have. So in this case, the community are effectively the investors. So what they've done is they've invested in. Now, another way of looking at this is from the investment perspective. Let's say I'm a large energy user. I'm a commercial site and I use 10 megawatt hours of electricity a day. And I pay 15 cents a kilowatt hour for what I use. Now, I could go out and buy a 200 kilowatt solar array and it would pay for itself in 5 years. Except I'm not going to do that, because I'm a commercial site and I make widgets, and I don't invest in things that have a 5-year return unless they're increasing my widget output. So because it's energy, it's not core business, I'm not going to make that investment. However, if I'm a community who has money to burn or money to invest, and I see that I could instead pay for those solar panels and sell the energy to that energy user, and I'll get a 5-year return, I'd say that's fantastic. that's 20%, or however you treat the return of investment in terms of discounted cash flows, and I won't get into that detailed area. So what's a good return for a mums and dads investor, or even an institutional investor, might not be something that the actual commercial energy user would consider. So in this case, the investor is the one who owns the panels, and the investor could be a group of investors, and they've purchased the solar array, and they sell what energy is generated to the commercial site. So
just like a business leasing computer equipment.
yeah, similar to that. And that's a good point about leasing. It could be that you're leasing the roof space to do it. It could be that you've got an arrangement that's just an exchange. It could be that the commercial site pays a little bit less than the energy they get from solar, so they win out as well, so they've got a vested interest. They save a bit of money, but even with that small amount they pay less than the grid, the cost of generating solar over the course of its life, including its asset cost, is around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. So if you can sell your energy for more than that, then you've made a profit. And that's the basic metric behind how it works for the consumers and the community to invest in.
How do the distributors and retailers going to react to this?
What a great question. The question was how are the distributors and retailers going to react to this? And I'll come back to that when we talk about some of the challenges that have been faced by us in relation to these projects. Yep.
Yeah, the sizing seems to be a big issue, because if you sized it to say 80%, particularly say South Melbourne market, it's only open 4 or 5 days a week. So the rest of the time, I'm presuming you put it back in the grid.
So it's a really good question. So the question
So you're going to
is,
lose money on
yep.
that.
Well, whether you lose money depends. So I said before that the value of the cost of the solar energy is effectively around 12 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, the energy that you send out to the grid is going to be sold into one of two ways. It will either be sold to an energy retailer for whatever they're prepared to offer you, and they're usually not prepared to offer much. You might get, if you're in an area that's got a mandated feed-in tariff, you might get 8 cents a kilowatt hour. However, these systems are above the size that you get mandated feed-in tariffs for. So it's a balancing act. What we're finding is that the optimal sites in terms of size are possibly ones where you use 80 or 90% of the energy on site, and 10 or 20% is exported. Now, you need to have, in some cases you need to have some export. The reason might be you could have a business that works for 6 days a week, and then 7 days a week, the 7th day of the week, the factory's closed, or whatever it is. Now, if you were to reduce the whole size of your system so that you never export, then you might be foregoing a lot of potential revenue for the sake of avoiding that export. So it's really a balancing act. If your average value, say, is that you're aiming for is 12 cents a kilowatt hour, and if the portion that you're using on site is offsetting consumption at 22, you don't need to have all of your export on site to make a profit. So even if it's only 80 or 90%, you do. So what you export to the grid, you might only be getting 8 cents or 6 cents a kilowatt hour for, but because that's all of the revenue, you can still make a profit. Depends on the size, but as you say, size is a key issue. The other issue is that if it's above a certain size, it doesn't just get the energy value, but also gets the value of the renewable energy certificates, which can be in the order of 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. More closer to 3 in a more competitive market, but possibly 4 or 5 cents a kilowatt hour. So that's over and above the premium for energy. So so size is important relative to export, but depending on the site, it's not necessarily a killer. The bigger issue is, getting back to this point about what retailers and distributors do and don't like about it, the bigger issue is getting cooperation from those businesses so that you can actually get the right value for energy.
Aren't some retailers pretty good?
Aren't some retailers really good? So
They're like Momentum or Red Energy or
that's a
someone
good
like that.
question to come back to.
Pro.
That's in the area of the challenges that we face. So I'll come back to that one. Yep.
Are there any tax implications when you're dealing with businesses like this? From live examples, they subjected to normal tax?
It's a good question, and it's one that with the community Coalition for Community Energy we're currently investigating, looking at the tax implications of projects and so on. and there are a few. I'm not really across the detail of them. There are some in relation to business investments and so on. There are potentially some loopholes that we're looking at around. I shouldn't say loopholes, because as soon as you say loopholes, the tax man comes and tries to close them. One thing that's interesting, I'll get on later to a thing called C3, which is something that ATA are very involved with. And it's a way of purchasing green power that avoids going through a retailer. And because it's sold through the ATA, which is a not-for-profit, it's a tax-deductible expense. That's an example of the sort of tax implications that we're hoping exist that allow for avoidance of costs there. We've got, I reckon, time for 2 more questions on this before we just move on a bit. There's a question over there, and someone here has had his hand up for a while. So,
sure, I'm from Rangers Energy, which you might be aware of. Probably contact with some stage.
Sorry, can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm from Rangers Energy, which we've been, the guy, I'm also a member of Epplin Wind, and Rangers Energy is to create a solar farm, right? We've investigated a couple of projects, and at the moment, hopefully in the next few months, we'll be able to get going on it.
great.
What we found, one of them is to make sure that the power must be used during the daylight hours, and especially in summer, where you're creating a lot of energy. And a specific one that I'm looking at the moment is a farm, an orchard that can use a lot of energy in packing and pumping water during the summer. So, I've just got this just in the last few days, so I haven't got all the details. And we've got to go link to that, as you said, they're paying roughly about 20 cents per kilowatt at the moment, and we'll be selling it to them probably a little bit less than that, so we make a gain on that when we get the 8 cents from the retailer. So that's if somebody wants to talk about it a little bit more later, you can. I've got some leaflets there. If anybody wants to become an investor, you're all welcome. You're a Victorian, and you've got $100 to become an investor.
Great.
And similar to Epplin Wind, I put quite a bit of money in Epplin Wind. I really believed in that quite a few years ago. It's paying dividends now because it's green energy and sustainable.
We're seeing a lot of Victorian sites that potentially have a return on investment of maybe up to, at best, probably around 10%.
Well, Epplin Wind's already paid the first
For solar?
10%, and they, as far as I know, they will be paying a dividend.
Yep. So for solar, yeah, up around 10%, based on where energy prices are at in Victoria and what the solar resource is. If you're really chasing the dollar, northern New South Wales and west of the Divide in New South Wales is the place to go. They've got really, really high energy prices, and they've got a better solar resource. And those are the 2 factors that drive up returns. There's one group that's, I wouldn't call them community, because it's people investing their superannuation funds themselves, who are doing this solar model, and they're getting about 20-25% return on investment when doing it. And that's a really safe return, because you're talking about systems that are covered by warranties with energy users who aren't going to stop using energy in a hurry. It's a really good return on investment. If you do bear in mind that at the end of 20-25 years, your asset value's gone, you've got something that's not worth anything, so you've got to recoup that in the life of the system. But it's a good return. We had another question over there, yep.
Yeah. I think one of the catches in this is that the potential sites or commercial sites that might be attractive for putting a medium scale solar park or whatever we call it. But a lot of those are already paying very little. They're paying industrial prices.
Yep.
And therefore the relativity and the benefit diminishes accordingly. So I suspect coming out of this, the opportunity is to identify those who are paying a premium and focus in on those to start with.
Yep, that's a good point, and that's why I mentioned before that there's that sweet spot. The biggest energy users aren't the ones where, even though they will use more of the energy on site, they're not the sites where you'll get the best return on investment. And what I suspect is that it's so energy customers in the national energy market fall into 2 categories. You've got they're called small and large. Whichever state you're in determines whether the crossover point is 100 megawatt hours a year or 160 megawatt hours a year of consumption. But basically, when customers are below a certain size, they become in a certain category. And from my crunching of the numbers, I think that the customers that are the sweet spot, if you like, are those that at the upper end of the small customer scale. So these are small commercial and industrial customers. They use probably between 50 and 160 megawatt hours a year, depending on which part of the national energy market that they're in, because they always pay a bit more for energy than the next level up. So,
Just following on from that, is there a way that you can actually put communities or aggregate people behind the meter that currently aren't, so that you can therefore everybody harness the potential of that in the way that we're talking about?
that's a great question, and that's a good one for leading into our challenges, because one of the challenges I'll get to will address that. So if I get to the end of the presentation and I haven't mentioned anything about virtual net metering, can you prompt me at that stage? Because that's exactly the solution to that one. All right. Any urgent questions before I move on? No? Anyone confused?
I'm just wondering how this affects not-for-profit organisations as to if they've got a large building and they want to put panels up, what's the scope of thing, what works, what doesn't?
So if you're talking about an organisation that rents or owns a building themselves, and I mean, they're like any other entity that buys energy. If you're a not-for-profit and you're in a building that you own or rent, then you're also an energy user. You invest in the panels you own them yourself, and you have that contract.
But they would give very little of the energy that's produced. Are they going to end up making a profit or not?
Would they what?
Would they end up making a profit? What's the sweet spot for them?
Well, that's just like anyone investing in solar on their own roof. It's a question of, are they paying enough for energy for it to be worth their while to invest in PV? Or are you talking about where you've got something other than someone putting panels on their own roof?
No, putting the panels on their own.
You've got to be able to use enough energy, enough power to make it worthwhile, but it's an investment. If you spend $50,000 to put a PV system up, then you've got to get a return on that.
Yeah.
It's whether you use that or you invest your money in some other areas.
If their only way of getting money back is to sell it back into the grid,
That's right.
are they going
Well,
to make a profit?
Well, the idea is that you size it so that you're not selling too much of it back into the
You've
grid.
got to use
size
it,
so
you've got to use it
most of
yourself.
on
You've
site.
got to have high usage, especially during the holiday.
It's exactly the same as if you're a home, a residential, making the same decision, or a business making the same
If they're
decision.
only using 5%.
Yeah, if you put in a massive system where you don't use much on site, then you're vulnerable to
200 or
the
300 square metres of space.
Yeah.
You know, if they're only using 5%, what's generated?
It's not worth it for us then.
Yep. If you don't use much of the energy on site, you don't get much for what you export. So, yeah. Well, yeah, we could talk about the value of energy exported to the grid, but it is a really complex thing to understand. I mean,
But as a not-for-profit organisation, do they get any special dividends or anything from government, any special dispensation?
probably not. The energy market's seen as this whole wonderful thing that's kept discrete from from the tax system and the welfare system and all
Because they
of
would
those.
get tax benefits, of course, but as a not-for-profit.
Don't think having not-for-profit status makes a difference to what you pay or get for energy. If we're ATA's not-for-profit, our energy bills are the same as anyone who uses the same amount of energy. If we put solar panels on our roof, it's going to cost us the same to install panels as anyone else. The returns that we got for sending energy out to the grid would be the same. The energy retailer is not going to give us a special deal. There might be aspects to do with tax, like if we could argue that it's something that reduces our taxable income, it might be that we could reduce it might be that there are tax implications around how the revenue is treated if we were generating revenue, but it wouldn't be enough to be the difference between a viable and a non-viable assessment. But I think the key point there is when we talk about the value of energy to the grid, and I guess you want us to move on, possibly Peter. So I'll be quick on this. You can't expect the energy that you send out to the grid to be worth the same as what you buy from the grid. For the same reason that you can't rock up to the supermarket with a bag of apples and expect them to buy the bag of apples from you at the same price that they sell you a bag of apples. And that's the key battle that we have in the energy market, is getting the energy market participants to accept that, hang on, that bag of apples still does have a value. Just because you don't normally buy it from us over the counter doesn't mean that that it doesn't have a value that should be.
Basically, it means the cost of setting it up is still too high.
Well, the cost of that, but through the energy market, there are costs other than the retail cost of energy. So the cost of the actual energy itself on a bill is only about a quarter of the actual bill. So that's the component that what you send out to the grid is actually.
What I'm saying is the cost of solar, the panels themselves and setting up is just too high.
Oh yeah, yeah. So when I talk about 12 cents per kilowatt hour being the cost of solar, 11 point something cents out of that is how you amortise the capital cost for setting it up over the life of the system and over the energy that it produces. All right, quick question before we move on from this one, yeah?
Related to that, so how much energy should you produce? Are you talking there about the average through the year, for example, or are you talking about the peaks?
It's a really good question. So when you look at the profile of generation from solar, it's important to remember the way generation and export is treated on the energy market, and it's instantaneous, and it's based on export and import. It's not based on consumption and generation per se. And this gets a bit confusing, you know. I'm always going to resort to a whiteboard, but I make a mess of whiteboards, so at a given point, if you're generating 100 kilowatts and you're using 80, you'll be exporting 20 kilowatts. Now, once it's exported, that's it. It counts as exported energy, and it's sold to the grid. You don't get that energy back later when you use energy at night. So it's important, therefore, that when you design the system, it's designed to take into account how much of that energy is going to overshoot your demand, and that has to be accounted for with a different value to what you use on site. And as I mentioned before, for a lot of these projects, using 80 or 90% on site of it seems to be the sort of sweet spot. Now, there's a lot of, before these projects become a reality, and some of them can become a reality now. Oh, thanks. Before they become a reality, we need to see some policy changes in the national energy market, because we're seeing a lot of challenges that are being met. And I'm going to try and go through a complex space very quickly. But first I should just explain what the national energy market is, because if you ask 10 different regular people on the street what it is, 9 of them will say, I don't know, and that other one will have an answer of any one of 10 different answers. So the national energy market describes the big interconnected electricity system that links South Australia, Victoria, ACT, New South Wales, Queensland, Victoria. No, what's the other one? Tasmania. That's it. Victoria too. So they're linked by the transmission network, which I've referred to up there. And that transmission network is the high voltage stuff with the big towers. It's operated by the transmission businesses. There's generators, large and small. Most of the generation comes from large generators, a lot of it coal, a bit of water, some wind, some solar. Most of it's centralised in areas like the Latrobe Valley, Hunter Valley, the Snowy, Tasmanian sites for generators, and other places where there's coal and gas-fired generation. It's taken from the transmission nodes through the distribution network, which is the poles and wires that you see that connect the big poles and wires, or the big lattice towers, through to energy consumers. They include households and commercial industrial sites and so on. And you've got the retail businesses. So the distribution businesses and the transmission businesses, they don't actually sell energy. They operate poles and wires, and they get money for doing so. The energy is actually bought from generators and sold to consumers by the retail businesses. The retail businesses also collect money from the consumers to give to the distribution businesses to pay them to operate the poles and wires. So the services that the distribution and transmission businesses give aren't actually involved in actually selling energy. They're selling the services around that. Now, this is the simple version of what the national energy market looks like, and I've deliberately avoided drawing attention to really complex relationships, but the important thing to remember here is that when you start looking at community energy, this simple relationship that consumers are used to having between themselves and the retailer for the purpose of energy going one way goes out the window, because a community energy proponent is, as well as being a consumer often, they're also a generator. They also have to deal with retailers, and they might even be a type of retailer or an exempt retailer if they're selling energy behind the meter. Then they'll have to deal with distribution businesses around things like grid connection. So the national energy market is a really complex space to negotiate, and it hasn't been set up to be dealt with by community organisations. So there's a lot of barriers. Some of the barriers are institutional, and I'm not going to go through this in detail, but that just describes at a high level the policy framework that I have to beat my head against every day in trying to effect some sort of change to make sustainable energy and affordable energy for more consumers a reality. So you've basically got this governance arrangement, you've got a rule maker, the AEMC, you've got a system operator, AEMO, and you've got a regulator. There's an economic regulator who does some other stuff as well. They report up to the big decision makers, which is the group which formerly known as MCE. It's all the state and Commonwealth energy ministers. They all get together and conspire to make energy more expensive for us. And there's other aspects that influence the energy market as well. In each state, you've got these legacy, and I say legacy because we're slowly moving towards national energy regulation and national energy frameworks. It used to all be state-based, but even council-based in some aspects. As we move towards that, there's still these legacy arrangements where some states still have their own retail regulation, for example, and still have jurisdictional instruments that influence distributors. Anyway, enough about that. It's complex and it's difficult to negotiate, and it's some of the reasons for some of the challenges that we're having stem from the fact that we've got this very well-established, antiquated design for a national energy market, the institutions in the energy market, and it's all been set up for one-way energy from coal-fired power stations and big hydro stations and gas through a system one way to consumers, and money goes back the other way. And now rooftop PV, community energy projects, all of that is challenging that paradigm, and with that a lot of the policy, a lot of the frameworks needs to change so that that can happen. One of the first challenges, and it's actually getting away from the energy market, but it's early stage finance for projects. So there's no shortage of interest in getting projects like this working. We're talking about community energy projects here, like PV and wind. There's a lot of organisations that are keen to do it. Often it's actually a good investment. When you find the right sites, it's a no-brainer. But there's a challenge in actually getting the finance to go through those early stages of project development. And that's a real barrier. It's one that might be met, I'm going to try and not get political, but some of you might have noticed today that Greens announced a $100 million program if they get in. So, I mean, whatever. If you see the pictures, I was hiding behind Adam Band as he was announcing it. So I mentioned before that we're involved in the Coalition for Community Energy, and although there's not a lot of certainty yet, I'd say this is another space to watch. I think you'll expect maybe one of the other big parties might have an interest in sort of matching what the Greens have said as well, saying that they'll make a commitment to community energy. I would hope that if Tony Abbott is determined to wind up the Clean Energy Financing Corporation, then he might consider putting something in its place that at least returns some prospect of renewable energy to the community. It's been interesting, and I'd like to see that happen. In any case, the barrier is getting that early stage finance and support. There's also other entities that are around looking at how they can support these projects, institutional investors saying, okay, this is high risk, potentially high return stuff. And when you diversify risk over a whole lot of projects, it actually makes it a lot lower risk. So maybe could actually win some support from institutional investors as well. Now, a question before about what do distributors think of this? So we don't have good frameworks in place for connecting things to the grid. At the moment, the energy distributors kind of have complete control, to a large extent, over what gets connected to the grid and how it gets connected to the grid. And if you've ever been involved in trying to get a project any larger than your own solar system for your home connected to the grid, you'll realise that it can take months or years of pain and effort as you go through that process. A lot of community renewable projects and just other non-community ones, but even private embedded generation projects have been caught out by this. I've worked in that space myself, and I can tell you it's really, really challenging under the current rules. So there's been a proposal put forward to change the current rules. This is being considered by the AEMC at the moment. Now this proposal will probably result in some streamlining and slight improvements to the process around getting projects connected to the grid. It's not actually designed for renewable projects though, it's actually designed for connecting gas and cogen systems to the grid. So there's aspects of renewable projects that won't be fixed by this, but it's a step in the right direction for changing that. And maybe with a bit more pressure over time, we'll see those improvements improved on further. The other big challenge here is getting a fair price for the energy that you sell. Now, I mentioned before that there's two ways, broadly speaking, you can sell energy. You can either sell it to a retailer, you can either sell it wholesale, or you can sell it directly to an energy customer. If you're behind the meter on the customer's side, that's when you can sell it to the customer. In that first place though, when you're trying to get a fair price for the energy that you sell to retailers, the reason that retailers don't like paying for the energy that you, the value of that energy that you send out to the grid is the same reason that even if you did rock up to the supermarket with your bag of apples and said, here you go, I'll sell you these for 25% of the price that you sell them for, they won't do it. The systems aren't set up to do that. They're not going to go through and do their quality inspection and everything for one bag of apples. They're not going to adjust their billing system so that someone can just sell them a bag of apples. They buy their apples on contracts many years in advance in the probably tons from producers who they can screw down to get the best price possible. So when it comes to selling energy to retailers where there's no mandate, no requirement such as a feed-in tariff for the retailers to buy that energy, they don't offer a good deal. Another of the reasons is that retailers tend to be vertically integrated with their own generators, which they're very reliant on, and any additional energy coming into their portfolio outside of that that is from the generators that they own doesn't give them the same return as the average wholesale value for that energy on the market. There's a few ways to get around this, and one way that's been looked at is the development of community energy retailers. So that is saying in the same way that we had community banks, back when community bank was actually a community bank, and you could have a community energy retailer that is actually not with vested interest in generation assets and private, but a community energy retailer that's a not-for-profit that has as its customers people who are sick of dealing with the large retailers, or the large retailers, and want to get a better deal. Now, large retailers do have the benefits of economies of scale and billing systems and so on. So the real barrier to it being a community retailer is the fact that you couldn't be one and actually sell energy to someone as cheap as what one of the big three retailers can. So it's a challenge to be overcome. But I think it seems clear that there's enough thirst from people who are sick of big retailers that are there at the moment that they would pay a bit more of energy just to know that it's not going to the profit margins of a vertically integrated company that's also investing in gas and coal, or that it's not going to the profit margins of someone else full stop. It could be reinvested into a community or back into their own pockets or whatever. So there's a lot of interest in that, but it's not without barriers. Yep.
With Hack Hydro and Meridian talking about being retailers themselves, are they likely to open up the opportunity to sell from community to them?
It's a good question. I've been in discussion with a few of those wind developers at different levels. I know that one of them is interested in entertaining the idea. Wind developers are starting to get the idea that there is, albeit it's small, very loud opposition to wind. And although I'd say they're in the minority in a lot of ways, and I say politicians count as a minority when you look at the whole population, some that are really opposed to wind. But there's a lot of community support. So what some of the wind developers are looking at doing is looking at ways that they can engage local communities in actually sharing the benefits of their wind farms beyond just the traditional payments for the piece of space where turbines are, and you know, payments to the local community funds and so on like that. And they include, there's one developer up in New South Wales, Infigen, who's got a project where they've basically said, okay, we've got a 40-something wind turbine project. We offer for the local community to invest in one of those wind turbines, so they can own it. They can have the revenue that's attached to it. They can call it theirs. They can paint it whatever colour they like. You know, there's those aspects to it. So I wouldn't be surprised if one of those wind developers who's also becoming a retailer is amenable to that idea. But it's really hard to get existing retailers of any type. Someone mentioned before, you know, what about Red Energy and what about Momentum? Aren't they better? Well, they're not the big three. There are the big three retailers who monopolise the market, and Momentum and Red do have a couple of things going for them. Mostly they're vertically integrated with old hydro rather than coal and gas, so notionally they're a little bit cleaner. Personally, I don't see there's a huge distinction in real terms, because the way energy is bought and sold in the national energy market means it all goes into and comes out of the same bucket. So if you want to affect purchasing cleaner energy, the way to do it is to go through to buy green power as opposed to pick a certain retailer. However, it comes back to the profit margins as well. If you choose a retailer who's not investing in coal and gas, then at least your profit margins aren't being, you know, drawn into that particular shareholder's pot. There are boutique retailers who have an interest in getting this stuff working, but they haven't really come out strongly in having any lost leaders or anything that would suggest that they're really willing to embrace community projects. Retailers are really drawn ultimately by volumes of customers. That's what makes them get excited. That's why they will, you know, pay people to go around and knock on your door and sign you up. They like getting numbers of customers signed up. That's how they view their profit margins and their bottom lines. And the reason they do that is because they know that on average a customer only changes retailer once every 5 years. So once they're with you, once you're with them, you know, they say, okay, there's a few $100 signed up for the next few years. Where existing retailers can probably be incentivised a bit through community projects, therefore, is through loyalty. So if you go to a retailer and say, hey, look, we can offer you a deal here. We're happy to sign a deal whereby we'll all contract with you for 2 years if you agree to, and we'll pay whatever, we'll pay your normal price, we'll contract with you for 2 years if you'll buy the energy from our project at a reasonable rate. Or maybe the reverse. You know, if you buy the energy from our project at a reasonable rate, will you also give us a discount on our energy? So there's different ways it can be done. Hepburn Wind struck up a deal with Red Energy, their retailer. It's not a bad outcome, but I think a retailer could do better in what they can offer to the community. I think if they're really, they seem to be very risk averse when it comes to these sorts of projects, overly so. And I think part of it does come back to the fact that they're vertically integrated, so generators are their competitors. So they would be investing in and supporting one of their competitors in supporting a community renewable energy project. So it's a hard paradigm for them to get around, or a hard concept.
And probably made worse as electricity consumption is going down.
Well, that's another thing as well. You know, the national energy market at the moment is entering into a period where we're seeing a lockdown from the retailers and generators who are concerned about where their profits that they thought they were going to get from all the stuff they invested in when they thought demand was going to go up. That's not happening now. Energy gets sold by generators into a competitive market. Now there's an oversupply. So there's depressed prices and the generators aren't making as much money. And because the generators are aligned with the retailers, you know, that's a risk that they're all bearing. Yep.
Diamond Energy guys came and spoke to us a few months ago.
Oh,
they're generators as well as
yep.
retailers, and they're renewable generators, is that
Yep.
right? Are they interested in getting energy from communities as well?
They are another for-profit retailer, and they are another retailer who is vulnerable to the economics of scale because they don't have a lot of customers. Their relative cost to serve is quite high. And like the other retailers, we haven't seen them actually do anything yet that suggests they're willing to offer a better deal for community renewable projects. I shouldn't, speak disparagingly of any specific business that is doing some stuff that is renewable, and that they are doing some good things. And over time, they've definitely done some good individual things in offering particular renewable projects a good return for the energy they sell, just offering the true value to the market. But I haven't seen Diamond or any other retailer actually take the next step of supporting the community renewable energy project.
Actually, in Diamond's the partner with the new solar power system in Jura. And I actually had a look at that on Sunday.
Oh yeah, is that a community project?
No.
No, it's just another investment project that they're buying the energy from.
That's right.
So, I mean, you're right, it's good that they're supporting those things, but they're doing it for profit because there's money in it.
Yeah.
And, they will support those projects. That's a lot lower risk for them than a community renewable project. But, yeah, thanks. I wasn't aware that they were investing in it. So, getting a fair price for energy sold to retailers is difficult. Yeah, there's an element of, well, we can't beat them, so maybe join them, become a retailer or a community retailer. Well, the other one is avoid them altogether. So it's always been challenging for projects. Now, this is really in the realms of the wind farm model, in the megawatt scale. It's always been challenging to sell energy onto the wholesale market because it costs you about $10,000 to get licensed, and then you've got prudential fees, and you've got compliance fees, and so on. And you have to register as an individual generator, and you've got jurisdictional obligations and stuff. And part of that challenge has now been overcome by the introduction of a new market participant in the wholesale market called a generator aggregator. So this is basically an entity. They call them a responsible person or a market participant. Those are the market jingos, or mingo. What they do is basically they will have a number of generators at a number of sites, but the market will see them as one generator. So they register once, and they act as an intermediary that allows for multiple small generators to access the wholesale market. That means they can participate in the market, avoid selling energy as a retailer, and avoid selling energy to a retailer, and they get spot market prices. Now, why would you want to participate in the wholesale market? Well, what does it mean? If you're participating in the spot market, it means that your generation is directly exposed to spot market prices. Now, our electricity bills might vary, might have off-peak of 14 cents a kilowatt hour, and might have peak of 30 something or whatever, and that would reflect an energy value of about $130 a megawatt hour up to 300 something. However, the actual value of energy on the grid varies from minus $1,000 a megawatt hour up to $13,100 a megawatt hour, and can change at any half hour. So it changes from one half hourly period to the next, and it varies at any time by those ranges. And that's the spot market price. Now, that's the price that retailers pay for the energy that they sell to you. Generally, it hovers between 20, 30, maybe $100 a megawatt hour, but it can spike. On hot days in summer, or when a transmission network fails, it can get up into the thousands. There's a cap at 13,100, which is if everything goes crazy and the price gets that high, then there's a cap to protect the risk of consumers. It can go negative to send a signal to generators to shut down when there's an oversupply. If you choose to become a generator aggregator, you'll be exposed to those price fluctuations. Why might it be a good idea though? It might be a good idea because if you don't do that and you're selling your energy to a retailer, they're charging you for managing the risk of that. So you won't get as good a deal. So if they're average, that they're likely to see the energy from your solar panels as being 7 cents a kilowatt hour, they'll only give you 6. They'll take another one of those cents, 1 cent for risk, or whatever it is.
Then you'd have to have storage in order to make that work properly, wouldn't
No, storage would benefit if you could do it cheaply, but solar generates at times when energy prices are generally worth a bit more. So on average, you're
price from solar, because it's not generating at night, will be worth a little bit more than the average.
Can you be wholesaler and retailer at one time?
You can, if you license as a retailer and register as a generator or generator aggregator.
So if you're a local community and you aggregate in a community, take a town or whatever, do you have to, at what level do you have to be before you have to define yourself or register yourself as a retailer? Because as an individual, you typically don't.
If you sell energy from the network side of a meter, so from the system side of a meter to a consumer, you have to be a retailer.
Okay. So the trick is to try and do what you can behind the meter.
Yes. If you sell it behind the meter, you can have what's called a retail exemption, and as long as the arrangement that you've got is to sell energy to that consumer, then within certain requirements that the AER has, you can act as an exempt retailer. Now, retail exemptions were actually set up originally so that caravan park owners and shopping centre owners could buy energy from the grid and sell it to the people who were in caravans and the shop owners. And now retail exemptions have now been extended, in theory, to apply to consumers who have, to where you've got someone owning the solar panels on the customer side of the grid who's selling the energy to the customer. However, the new guidelines that the AER has produced on this have 3 different types of exemptions. They've got deemed exemptions and standard exemptions, where as long as you fulfill certain criteria, you've effectively got an automatic exemption. For this arrangement though, they're treating it as what they've called an individual exemption, meaning that if you want to do this, if you want to sell energy to a customer, you have to go to the AER and get approval to do so first. There's certain conditions that they've flagged that will need to be met for that, but they haven't been prescriptive in how they've said they'll treat that assessment. You can do it. But you can't sell energy from the grid to a consumer without being a licensed retailer, not even a single consumer.
Yeah, so if you had storage as a solution, you could just sell to yourself and be a not-for-profit behind the grid, behind the meter.
Well, if you don't need to sell to yourself,
No,
to generate for yourself. But if you need selling to, you could do that, but the cost of storage won't make it worth it. I mean, the cost of storage is,
sure, that's
yeah. But if you did, yeah.
Are there any of those community solar where they're selling to a big corporate or something else running it, or are they all still opposed to it?
That's a good question. There are some running. I don't think the ones that are running are community per se.
Right.
They're investors. You can call them community because they're shareholders, but they're not large numbers of shareholders, like in the hundreds, and they're not established as not-for-profits, or they don't have an emotional attachment to a particular community. They're making a good buck out of it, good on it, but they're not. None of the community ones have been. There's a few that are council initiated that are progressing. I expect that we'll see some in Sydney probably first off. They seem to be a long way down the track. There's a large number in Victoria that are interested in that as well. And in WA. WA is another spot where the return on investment for this is just through the roof. Because they don't have, large energy users in WA don't have as big, effectively, discounts on their energy use as large energy users do here. There's data centres in WA that are still paying 20 cents a kilowatt hour for energy, which is much more than big commercial industrial users are paying here. All right, so selling energy is a real challenge, and there's a few things that have been done at the moment to get around that. Now, how are we going for time?
Fine.
Fine? Okay, cool. So, now this is another challenge, and quite an interesting one. In fact, I'm going to take a bit of a diversion here because it's a good time to. I might just let people know about the smart meter guide, if you like. Okay, so I brought a bunch of these with me. Some of you might have seen it, and this is just an intermission in our presentation tonight, and it's topical because we're about to talk about smart meters. So I thought it would be a good bit of background as you all know, in Victoria, we've got these fantastic things called smart meters that are going to change the world and make it a better place, and babysit our children for us, and order food for us when our fridges are running low on food, and our energy bills are just going to plummet through the floor, and solar panels will sprout out of our roofs, and pigs will fly, and I'll take photos of you in the shower. Not the pigs, the smart meters. So ATA is very involved with the policy argy-bargy around things like smart meters. The decision to roll out smart meters in Victoria was made before we got heavily involved in the policy stuff, made some years ago. We've been very, very active in campaigning on behalf of our members and on behalf of other people in having a sensible approach to any new technology like smart meters. The Victorian smart meter rollout has been a complete disaster. It's cost consumers a hell of a lot of money. Our view is that it was done probably a few years prematurely, and if they were to do it now, the costs would be a lot lower, and they'd be able to implement it with better technology. But Victoria really likes to think that it leads the way in energy. It likes to privatise first, it likes to deregulate first, it likes to expose its consumers to all of these wonderful market issues first. And so I've decided to be the first state to roll out smart meters across the city, across the whole state. Whether you think smart meters are good or bad, and we actually think that they're good, they've just been done woefully in Victoria, and unfortunately they're not likely to be done now on a broad mandated level as a result in any other state. And the reason for that is that they're now politically unsavoury, even though the costs of smart meters have now plummeted for reasons that are partly to do with the fact that the technology is mature. Anyway, in Victoria, there was a big gap in what information that the government was providing to consumers about smart meters for quite a number of years, and that gap was being filled by media and by community concerns and by concerns from organisations like ourselves saying, maybe you should tell people what you're doing and try and do it properly. While we beaver away in the background, focusing now on trying to get them to deliver the benefits of the smart meters because they've committed to rolling them out anyway, we got funding from the Lord Mayor's Charitable Fund to produce a short guide, sort of plain English, to fill that knowledge gap about what smart meters actually do and what they mean. So we've provided this impartial guide because, of course, what was coming from energy businesses and what little was coming from the government was generally either glowing or lacking in detail. So we thought we'd actually produce a guide that's impartial, but it describes just plainly what the services are that smart meters can do, what they're likely to do in the short term and the longer term in Victoria, and there's a starting point for people who are considering these to actually have some background information. So they talk about in-home displays, which are devices that can help you to understand your energy use. Well, have a look in the guide. Energy web portals. Yeah, there's a couple available. For one of them, you have to be with a particular retailer, and another one's available for sale for around 60 or 70 bucks. There's a picture of it here. Energy web portals, which are online portals that can show you how much energy you've used and when and so on. Flexible pricing, so this is the big one that's coming up soon. And a moratorium on time of use pricing in Victoria. That's when you pay more or less for the energy you use depending on the time of day. Even though that's a concept a lot of people are familiar with from having off-peak. A lot of solar customers are familiar with it because they were moved to time of use pricing when they installed their solar panels anyway. We'll see 3-part time of use pricing being introduced from September on a voluntary basis. It's actually potentially going to be a good idea for some people to move to because some people will be able to avoid cross-subsidising other consumers by moving to flexible pricing. The people who are going to benefit from moving to flexible pricing will be, for example, the people who don't own air conditioners, who aren't, who use less energy during those high peak times in the summer. People who use less energy during peak times generally. At the moment, those people are cross-subsidising everyone who does use more during peak. So for some of those people, flexible pricing will be a good thing. In fact, studies seem to indicate that for 70 or 80% of people will be winners if they move to flexible pricing. But only if the flexible pricing is cost reflective, which will bring me back to that point soon. And we talk about the risks and availability of all these things. It's a short guide. Feel free to take a bunch of them. Direct load control is an exciting one that smart meters can do, but we're not seeing that implemented yet, and that's when smart meters can be used to cycle loads. You can voluntarily have cycled like a hot water or a pool pump or even an air conditioner in return for having a rebate or an energy saving for avoiding some energy demand during peak times, which cost a lot to supply energy. And smart appliances, which can do the same. And also smart meter technology being used for notification of notification of messages about things like energy use. So there's a guide about that. And obviously some people find smart meters expensive. Yeah, so we try and be, well, we're not impartial about smart meters. We kind of slam government where they deserve it for getting things totally wrong. But our focus now is saying, well, there is some cost and they're happening anyway, so let's get those benefits out. Let's inform people about what they can do. So, getting back to the challenges, one of the challenges that we have in just generally in relation to community energy, because it relates to a lot of these things, is the lack of cost-reflective pricing and smart technology. Now, you don't need to have smart meters to have things like load control, but it helps. And now that the pricing of smart meters has come down, this is more of a case for states other than Australia, other than Victoria, it would make sense to couple smart meters, cost-reflective pricing, and the technology to get into people's homes to do things like load control and help give them better information about how they use energy. If you have smart metering, it can actually help with different types of community energy projects. Not just community renewable energy, but where communities are interested in looking at alternatives to having high peak demand in the area that drives up everyone's bills, when you can have some consumers voluntarily reducing their peak demand, getting paid to do so. You need technology to actually report that that's happening. You can't do it with just old accumulation meters and no remote communications. So the lack of that technology is a bit of a barrier to community energy generally. In Victoria, we've got the smart meters, waiting to see how long it takes us to get some more advanced functions activated in those. In other states, what we'll likely see in the next few years is the implementation of some recommendations that came out of a review the Australian Energy Market Commission did, called Power of Choice Review, and there was actually a really good outcome that we were quite active in pushing for. Basically, it was a review that they did into ability for demands for consumers to participate in the national energy market in a way beyond just buying energy. So they looked at generation of energy, they looked at direct load control, they looked at the technology, they looked at how people pay for energy, they looked at all sorts of stuff. And it is so detailed and complex that we would be here for hours if I focused on the actual detail of what all of those specific changes are. Now another one that relates to that is that we have at the moment what's called an energy-only market. Now I mentioned before that the price of energy on the wholesale market can go up to $13,000. Now when you think about it, if I've got, say, a mining operation and I've got a crusher that's sitting there and it uses 10 megawatts or whatever, if the energy market operator decides on this particular day that they need to turn on a lot more generators and the price is getting up into the thousands, wouldn't it make more sense just to pay me a few hundred or 1,000 or so to turn my crusher off instead of turning on more generation? It would. But the way our current energy market works at the moment doesn't allow for that. You actually can't get the value of it. You can only pay generators. You can't pay people to switch off. And this has been identified as an issue. In fact, this is another thing that has come out of that Power of Choice review that I mentioned. In order to fix it, AEMO, which is the Australian Energy Market Operator, are now developing a new mechanism to the energy market, which allows for loads, large commercial loads, such as a crusher at a mining site, or a cold store, or some loads at a smelter to be switched off and paid for the spot price for energy. So they can actually get paid instead of a generator getting paid. By them getting paid the spot price, it means that the next most expensive generator isn't being dispatched. So that actually saves money for everyone. It means that we've got a more effective, competitive energy market. Some energy markets already have this, but Australia, or the NEM in Australia, as I said before, was very much designed around this one-way flow of energy, where energy goes one way, dollars go the other. You don't stop using energy, you just keep using more of it, and the generators get paid more. So there's a lot of resistance from the generators and from the retailers in this particular mechanism, because it's not actually designed for generators or retailers. There's a new market participant being introduced that will be a competitor with them. So it's a really, really challenging space. We, as I alluded to, we're on the committee that's helping AMO design this mechanism, and it's interesting. I'll tell you that much.
Some of the US states already have that, do they?
Yep, even WA's got it. WA has what's called a capacity market, which operates a bit differently to an energy-only market. In WA, you don't get paid for the megawatt hour, well, you do get paid for the megawatt hours you produce, but most of your payment is based on your ability to be there as a generator. So you'll be there, you'll be on call, effectively, within certain parameters. And that's an easier arrangement for demand response to actually access than this energy-only arrangement where it's just based on the per megawatt hour value. So it's obviously very complex, because if you're paying someone to switch off, you've got to be able to guess how much energy they were going to use anyway, which means that there's these baselining methods that have to be implemented. It's quite a new thing in the energy market. You have to remunerate them based on saying, okay, well, you were going to be using 10 megawatts during this time, but we've only got you metered as using 2, so we'll pay you back for the 8. It's a challenging thing to work out. Yep.
If you were buying, if you was a user was able to buy power at the spot price,
yep,
that would have exactly the same effect.
That's exactly right. That's the 10-point question of the night, I reckon. So if there's different ways that you can be an energy customer, and you can actually be what's called a market customer, where you buy all your energy at spot price. And the beauty of being a market customer is that on average, over time, you should have lower energy costs. For the same reason as I mentioned before with generation and retailers, because what retailers do in between you and the market is they hedge your risk. So as a customer, you could choose to do that, and over the long term, you'd probably be better off, or you'd definitely be better off over the long term. But
where you say you can, you mean even a retail customer?
What's that?
You mean even a retail customer or a large commercial customer?
Well, if you're a large commercial customer,
yeah.
I mean, if you're a large commercial customer, you would be a retail customer. So you'd normally be, you have a choice of being a customer of a retailer,
yep,
where the retailer does that exposure to risk, they smooth that out for you,
yep, or
you just expose yourself directly to the market prices. So what you pay for energy on one day might be $1,000 as a commercial customer, and on another day to use the same amount of energy might be $50,000. That's the sort of volatility that you would be exposed to. But you can, but only about 2 or 3 commercial customers have ever done that in the history of the national energy market, because it's just not been worth it for them. Yep.
Do they send out some kind of code which tells people what the price is they're going to be paying? I mean, since it's such a huge variation.
So what they do, so what AEMO does is they do forecasts. They do hours ahead and days ahead, months ahead and years ahead forecasts of what they think the demand will be. I don't think they actually forecast prices in that, because they want to be a bit careful. The dispatch interval though is at 5 minutes. Now what that means is you've got 2 types of generators, broadly speaking. You've got, I always struggle to simplify this one. Let's call them price makers and price takers. And the price makers are what you call scheduled generators, and the price takers are what you call unscheduled generators. Now, price makers, they provide bids to AEMO. So they'll say, for example, I'll switch on when the price gets to $400 a megawatt hour. Another one says, I'll switch on when it gets to 1,200. Another one says, I'll switch on when it's at 9,000. And so those generators are dispatched as more energy is needed on the market, and the price that they get goes into a magic formula that spits out how much all the other generators are paid. So on the energy market, you've got those consumers who, and the dispatch interval is 5 minutes. So you might have less than 5 minutes warning to switch on if you're a generator. And then you have to switch on for at least half an hour, and the settlement for what you generate will be based on the price variation over that half-hour period. So you don't have advance warning of the actual price beyond being told, if you're a scheduled generator, a price maker, to switch on at a specific time, and that'll be based on the price that you've bid into the market at.
I was thinking more of the person who is paying the spot price rather than the person who is taking the spot price. You were talking about this possibility of taking the penny for turning your crusher off.
Yep.
What kind of warning does the end consumer have that he's about to pay 10,000?
They'll probably get told 5 minutes after they've started paying 10,000.
Yeah, that's what
if they've got ready access to that. Now that means that if they see the price trending north, they would just turn it off. I mean, because the prices, they do go crazy. Like you will sometimes see it leap from, if you have a transmission outage, for example, the price might leap in the space of 5 minutes from $200 to $7,000. But that's not so common as you're having some advance warning. So if, for example, the price has hit $1,000 a megawatt hour, you would probably say, we know that there's some generators out there who are gaming and they're rebidding, and we know that demand is going to go up further for the next half hour or so, so the price isn't going to go any lower. So if I'm prepared to turn off that crusher, I'll do it now, because when the price does keep going, it will get up to that level where it's worthwhile doing it. So this is a really complex space around the demand management stuff. Seem to have skipped stuff there. It's a complex space, the demand management stuff, and it's one that's requiring a complex solution. Yep.
As I picture it, the spot price goes up and down a lot dynamically. Its average is what we're kind of used to playing it,
exactly,
if you like.
Yep.
But the peaks go way above that. So there's an incentive for somebody who's able to shed load to respond to those high going peak prices and make a substantial, lower their costs substantially.
Absolutely, yep. Interestingly, because demand has reduced so much, as you mentioned before, in the last few years, we're not seeing such high spot prices now. So it'll be interesting to see what the business case becomes for these demand response participants, because they benefit from, you see, the way it works is that these demand response participants will still have a normal retail contract. They'll still buy energy from that retailer. In fact, the retailer will be paid as if nothing ever happened, because they need to keep the market whole. You can't double dip the energy that they are selling into the market by both reducing the retailer's demand and retailers' demand on the market and their customers' demand. They need to be selling it as if it's generation. So for that reason, the retailer won't even see any difference. They'll just be selling energy to the consumer that the energy is using as if the consumer's using as if they're not using it. And it'll be based on that average that they sell the consumer energy at, which might be $100 a megawatt hour for that particular consumer. But the spot price that the consumer is being paid for avoiding the load might be $5,000 or $10,000. So it's a pretty clever arrangement, but anything that's clever is almost necessarily complex. That's the way that one's going.
Hopefully the smart meters will be able to take over some of that process.
Well, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. So for the demand response mechanism, selling your demand response into the wholesale market, it looks like that's not going to be available for smaller consumers like residential scale consumers. So they would need smart meters to be able to do that. However, large industries, commercial businesses have remotely read interval meters anyway, which is most of the functionality of smart meters. So yeah, you do need smart meters to do that, or in this case, remotely read interval meters, which are like a not so smart version of a smart meter. But yeah, that's a key thing, so that those businesses can so that they can record what the actual load is that's reduced when it's
So I was thinking, like in somewhere you could have your air conditioning set up and opt in that in peak demand your air conditioning shuts down.
Yep, that's exactly right. In fact, that leads into this third point here in terms of not so much the issue but the solution. So the wholesale market won't, demand response mechanism unfortunately won't be open to residential consumers in the first instance when it's introduced in 2015. We're hoping and we're pushing for that to be expanded to include residential consumers because we think it'll be a no-brainer, but the energy market operator doesn't want to see a new, million market participants in the short term with every household going online.
Might save them building another generator.
But the thing is, they don't build generators, they just handle the data and the money.
Stop somebody building
Yeah,
a generator.
well that would be the ideal. And we hope that it will. I mean, it will have benefits for all consumers anyway, because it will improve competition. So even the consumers who aren't able to participate will still benefit from, downward pressure on energy prices. So that's good. But what you're referring to, the consumers will be able to do, hopefully in the shorter term with smart technology, is in this area. So currently, the energy networks are built a little bit similarly to the energy-only market. They're just designed to supply. And we know that a lot of the networks are only heavily overloaded for a short period of the year or a short period of every few years. And the rest of the time, they're heavily underloaded. This means that a lot of networks in a lot of areas are being built to excess capacity. And that's not cheap. Most of the reason that energy bills across Australia have gone up in the last few years is due to network costs. Interestingly, they've gone up a lot in Victoria as well. Not so much of that's due to network costs. Victoria's networks are relatively efficient. You might be interested to know this. It's actually something that lends to potential value of privatisation, maybe not being so bad after all. There's something controversial for you. Now, network prices in Victoria are lower than the government-owned utilities in just about any other state. So when we do bemoan the evils of privatisation, just think it might have its upsides as well. But nonetheless, they are private, and so they're not very good at sharing information with us. They call almost every bit of information they have commercial in confidence, and even if you pay for it, sometimes you can't access it. So they've been under a lot of scrutiny for this. There have been changes to the rules. They've been wrapped over the knuckles by the, very gently wrapped over the knuckles by the regulator, and very gently wrapped over the knuckles by the Energy Market Commission. And the rules have been changed that dictate how transparent and inclusive they have to be in the consultation processes and in developing up their costings. They're regulated monopolies, so they don't face competition, except for when people get sick of them and buy batteries and solar panels to go off grid. It's the only competition they'll ever have, and that'll take them by surprise when it happens. They don't face competition. They've got a regulated asset base that they've got a lot of interest in. They get approved for a very high weighted average cost of capital. What this means is that they get to hold on to money, and it gets an investment or make investments, and it gets treated as if they're paying 10% interest on it, when in actual fact they're only paying 6%. So what it means, it's like me basically borrowing money from you and getting 10% and giving you back 6%. I just have money flowing in for doing nothing. Yeah, so they've come under all the scrutiny for that as well. There's been a massive suite of reforms around network regulation to change some aspects of that.
That what happened with Transgrid in New South Wales recently, that was on the television?
Now, was theirs, trying to remember, was that the whole Grid Australia fiasco?
Transgrid, where they were building at capacity they didn't need simply because they got the 10% maturities like insurance.
Yeah. Look, it's also partly because it builds into their pricing determinations period.
Money to do nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. And look, don't get me started. Anyway, some of the good outcomes are that they are, the distribution networks will be required now when they want to invest more than, I think it's $3 million in building more network. I won't say gold plating, but there you go, I said it. When they want to invest more than $3 million in building a new bit of network, they have to go out and consult and say, okay, we want to build a new bit of network between here and there, but have you got any better ideas? Now, if the network investment, let's say it's $10 million, would be required to upgrade the supply to a certain town,
But if the people in that town actually said, well, hang on, if you give us 5 million instead, we'll just like turn our air conditioners off occasionally and change our electric hot water to electric heat pump and put on some solar boost and put in some battery storage, and then you won't need to upgrade. Okay, everyone's a winner. The town gets some money, the community renewable energy project or the community project has $5 million, and the network spends $5 million less, which means that all the other consumers on the network who pay for that 10 million are instead paying for 5. So this is what these new tests, or regulatory investment tests, which are not completely new, they're an improved version of an old test, should result in.
Their long-term revenue goes down. They would like this because their long-term revenue goes down.
Yep. So the way their revenue is calculated is pretty complex. There's elements that are adjusted on 5-year rolling period. There's elements that are adjusted at the end of each 5-year period for the regulatory reset. And there's elements that are adjusted each year. How this is treated would depend on whether it was, it depends on whether elements of an investment are treated as capex and elements of operation are treated as OPEX, or this obscure in-the-middle thing they use called REPEX, which is replacing assets. It's a real, it's an economist wet dream and everyone else's nightmare. Like, it really is tedious stuff to try and understand. But yeah, you're right. The short answer is their revenue can go down.
They'd rather just spend the 10.
Yeah, yeah. They would much rather spend the 10 million. Because if they spend that 10 million, they get to borrow against it, and they get to make that investment against it, and they're investing and they get their 10% back, and blah blah. Anyway, yeah, they're not really friendly. Having said that, they're starting. You'll be amazed to know they're starting to engage with us now. So the whole process around those regulatory determinations in the past. In fact, this is something I didn't really mention this here, but this is actually another big sort of breakthrough that's related to this. Because the networks have come under so much scrutiny, they've now realised that they do need to engage with consumers more, and they're starting to consult now as they enter into those 5-year planning cycles. So they're saying, okay, we're planning for the next 5-year regulatory period, which in Victoria is 2015 or 16 to 2019 or 20. And they're saying, we're planning for that, let's engage with consumers and see what they want. And that's effectively like a type of community engagement as well. So,
so when you say the consumer, that they obviously don't advertise in the paper.
No, well, there's the thing. So, remember I said before, there's about 20 consumer advocates in Australia, and we're the ones who, will get the call and ask if we'll come and talk to them about this or that or whatever. And what we're encouraging them to do, because they need to strike a balance. There's stuff that's highly technical, and the culture of distribution businesses is such that they just think all consumers are dumb. They say, you guys don't understand our economics, and you don't understand how we need to do this and build poles and wires here, and we've got substations here to do this and that, and we've got to comply with these long list of rules from the economic regulator, and we've got these safety requirements, and they think, so we won't ask consumers about that stuff. But the point is, that's why the consumer advocates exist. So that there are people out there who do have some idea of at least some elements of those and can talk in that language with them and understand what their issues are and say, well, maybe there's some better ways of doing this. Because in fairness to the businesses, it's businesses always for them. Building poles and wires is how they deal with problems. They come from in Victoria, for example, they're deeply rooted, although they've long removed from that, in the old days of the SEC, where, you build poles and wires and you look forward to a time when you needed to use up this capacity, and you didn't have such dramatic increases in demand as we do now, and it was a very, very different time. But a lot of elements of the old paradigm in different states are still there. So now, with all the changes that are being made, some of it's caught up with them, some of it's caught up with the energy market, and some of the outcomes have resulted in this scrutiny, which has resulted in more engagement with consumers. And so, aside from just the RIC-D, which I mentioned, there's actual voluntary engagement in planning processes as well.
There's a question about the virtual metering. You mentioned that something like this, I don't know, exists or is going to exist.
Yep.
Because the concept is pretty, I believe, good.
Yep.
Is this happening, or?
So that's a good question, and one that I'll answer as soon as I've closed off on this last topic on here, because then we'll just be at the mercy of how often people fall asleep, or unless you want to give me an indication for how long we've got.
Well, don't ask me. I'd say let's ask the audience. Is
Okay.
everybody comfortable? I mean, I personally would like to get back to more things which are more relevant to the community aspect.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, that's
this
exactly-
it's not to say this isn't interesting. It is.
Yep.
It's acronym heaven for a start.
Sure.
Yeah. I mean, for example, is everybody comfortable if we spend another 15 minutes?
Yeah. Okay, so what I'll do, because that question is directly into the community renewable energy stuff, and this last point is here as well. So I'll quickly close off on the last point. Now, one of the other issues that community renewable projects need to address is not just selling the energy, but it's selling the renewable energy certificates. And any community renewable energy project will fall into one of two categories. Either it sells renewable energy certificates which are SRES, or sorry, into the small renewable energy market, which is a deemed market where they get a certain value, or it'll sell them into the competitive renewable energy certificate market, which is the LREM.
What's the threshold on that again?
If you're solar PV, it's 100 kilowatts. If you're wind, it's 10. If you're hydro, it's 6.4. So if one of the challenges is getting a good price for your RECs when you sell them into the energy market, and there's actually been a new thing set up which ATA is closely involved with called C3. It's a website that allows people to buy green power, and it can be a good way to support community renewable energy projects when they come online and sell their green power certificates into C3. And it means that, I mean, I'd just say go and check out the website, is the short version. You can see how it works. What we hope to introduce in the next year or so is a facility that allows specific projects to sell their green power through that. And that means for these community renewable projects, they'll be able to get higher value effectively for the energy that they sell, because the energy, because green power certificates are attached to the volume of energy. So the question was about virtual net metering. And this is the thing I wanted to say for last, because it's so exciting. It would wake everyone up. So we've talked about this idea that you've got energy being generated on site, and it might be in one location, and you've got your investors in other locations. Now, the other thing that people are really interested in from a community energy perspective is this idea of that you can close the loop, that you can invest in your generator on the rooftop of a commercial and industrial building, and you as a customer can actually purchase the energy from that, even though you live down the street and around the corner, 5 k's away. So currently in the energy market, you can technically do this already. If you've got an energy retailer and you've got a contract with them, and they're also buying the energy from your, so let's say you're a community renewable energy investor, you invest in a project over here that's got solar panels there. If you have the same retailer as for your consumption as is buying the energy that you're generating, then they can net one off against the other. And they can say, all right, we'll subtract the energy cost from here off your actual bill for the component that you're using, and they can do that with multiple customers. So if you've got 100 investors each using 1 kilowatt, and your turbine or your solar PV array is exporting 100 kilowatts, then you've got a cancelling out of the energy. It's wonderful.
Don't have to run around cables.
But there's a problem. The problem is that as the energy comes out, it's transacted with the energy market, it's sold to the retailer, and it becomes their property. As the energy comes into your property, though, it's treated exactly the same as all the other energy that's come into your property. It's actually got all the distribution and other charges attached to it. So even though you can do this technically, you can't benefit from it at the moment, because there's no way of actually drawing a link between the value of the energy that comes out of that site and that comes into the other side. So what a lot of the community renewable organisations are doing is saying, well, why can't we change this? If the electrons are only going up the road and out the door and back again, why can't we have a cheaper value for that energy? And this is something that we're looking very closely at in the national energy market and saying, okay, how can we do that? Because it could actually be a benefit to more of these communities. It could mean mean, the detail of how it could work is complex, but the short version is when you go back to those different models that we had of community energy, and you say, okay, within solar we've got more than one. We've got the one where you've got the solar energy on the roof, you've got the one where it's on the wholesale market, you've got the issue of the value of the energy you export from the grid, and as was mentioned before, if you've got a business that's closed on a Sunday because no one's working and everyone's at home, then you might be exporting more on Sunday. Well, on Sunday everyone is at home, so why not actually sell that energy to the people who are at home, where they are using it? If virtual net metering arrangements can be put in place in a way that's cost reflective, and this is really one of the other, this is why this is actually really important for community renewable energy. If it can be cost reflective, then communities should be able to capture that value. And what it could mean in real terms is, for example, I might live in a rental apartment in South Melbourne, and the LIVE project, which is looking at putting a community-owned solar project on the South Melbourne market, they might say, okay, well, because I'm in a rental apartment, I can't install my own solar panels, but I can invest in putting some solar panels over here on LIVE, and they can effectively be mine, and the energy that comes out of those, I might get at a slightly cheaper rate, because the energy that comes out of those is only going out of this site and as far as the local neighbourhood. And it's offsetting energy that's come all the way from Latrobe Valley, from dirty coal-fired power stations, or from Basslink and Tasmania, or from South Australia, or wherever.
But, distribution of that power is exactly the same. The customer on the other side of the town needs to have this energy delivered. And is there any difference between this energy is flowing from this side than the other side, like the generators? Because the cost of transmitting is going to be exactly the same.
The difference is that you're not using the transmission network, for a start.
Which should decrease the cost anyway.
Yep. The cost of what?
Well, the transmission. It's like,
yep. It decreases the cost, but the issue is at the moment, the way the charges are structured, is that there's no way for the retailer, or the distributor, I should say, to differentiate between the customer who has that arrangement and their next door neighbour. So all the energy that they use has to have those charges attached to it. And those charges include what are called transmission network use of service charges. So that means that you'll be paying for the use of the transmission network even though you're not using it. So one of the ideas is that there needs to be a wheeling charge, which is rather than have a normal, I'm trying to avoid acronyms, rather than have the normal suite of charges that are attached to the distribution component of the energy you use, which is about a third of your bill, saying, okay, if we reduce that based on a whole lot of stuff, which is more acronyms avoided, then everyone's a winner. And that's the idea behind virtual net metering. So, question there.
Yeah, no, I mean, just, I think we partly addressed that, because the transmission distribution is actually a very large component of the bill, or disproportionately large for those of us who perhaps think we could do without paying that. And it seems that the power companies are very loath to actually provide any of that information. I think the government forced their hand last year for some surveys and things that were done there, all the customers doing survey, whatever. So, firstly, are they likely to provide more information on those true charges? And secondly, I understand the sophistication or the complexity of that, trying to, with the management systems, and trying to manage what you were just talking about before. And how long do you think it'll be before this gets unravelled, so that we could see the benefit of and start planning around it?
So, the charges that are called network use and service charges. Now, network is your distribution and transmission network combined. They are actually half transparent. The bits that are transparent are the distribution components, because they're regulated by the AER and they're actually published by the distributors. And that's what the retailer is charged, which they on-charge to you. But the retailer doesn't itemise that in the bill. So what you're talking about when you say there's a lack of transparency is we don't see what how the retailer decides to charge you what they charge. If you know where to look You can actually go out and find out exactly what the retailer is paying on your behalf for the distribution, for the network use of service charges. Now, the issue is that when you look at those NUOS charges, it's difficult to distinguish how the transmission charges are actually allocated, because the transmission charges are charged to the distributor by the transmission company, and the distributor chooses to allocate those how they like to consumers. So it's actually difficult, even though you might be able to see that amount and know, okay, I'm avoiding that charge, that won't necessarily tell you the actual value of what you're avoiding to other consumers on the market more broadly. So one issue that needs to be fixed so that we can fix that other issue of that transparency is having transparency around how distributors choose to charge for the bits that they're charged for.
Or some rules or something that are clear.
Yeah. Well, more prescriptive calculations that are based on principles rather than based on them deciding which consumers they want to upset least. And usually that's based on them saying, well, which consumers actually understand this better? And the consumers who understand it are the large energy users, because they're the ones who can afford to pay consultants to look at the breakdown of their bills, and they're the ones who get itemised bills telling them exactly how much their DUOS and CHUOS charges are. So what I strongly suspect from what I've been able to deduce is that small residential consumers, you and me and householders, are actually paying a disproportionately much larger amount because it's up to the networks to charge to how they want, and we don't have that ability to access the information, and where we do have it, the networks don't realise that we're actually smart enough to understand it. So I think that might change, and I think that as we start to investigate options for virtual net metering, and it will require changes to the rules to actually make it cost effective. As that happens, we'll begin to see some of those cost elements exposed and come under more scrutiny. Now you ask when it would happen. Things change pretty slowly in the energy market. I've been beating my head against that brick wall for 4 years, and before that, before I worked with ATA, I was, not as an advocate, but as someone trying to get projects going, 6 years before that, and I've seen very little change for most of that time, but I have seen in the last 2 or 3 years a really exciting rate of change. And if the change of the last 2 or 3 years continues with the pace it does, and with the interest of community renewable energy proponents behind it, at the pace that it has, I reckon we could see some developments in the next 2 or 3 years that start to make that more of a reality. And when you consider the process that's involved in actually changing things in the market, if everything goes smoothly, and if you've got a lot of vested interest on your side, then you can make a really obvious change that desperately needs to be made clear to everyone in about 18 to 24 months. If you're trying to do something a bit more creative, like virtual net metering, and you have communities on your side but not the vested interest, then you're relying on political support, and it's hard to get that. If you do have that, maybe you could get it done in 3 years. I mean, this is just speculation, but it's not going to occur as quickly. Streamlined, fast changes to the rules can be done and implemented within a year and a half by the shortest path. But we don't have the resources or the support to do that at that rate. Thanks.
Well, probably doing the pilots will identify all these different numbers that are hidden, and that could speed up the process. Because right now we don't know, and someone needs to look into it, but let's say that we build 100 like 1 megawatt of power and trying to distribute it, and this is our pilot, and trying to engage the party to agree to this, and based on this we may provide some reasonable numbers that will dramatically speed the process, because you rely on something that's controlled very accurately.
The problem with that idea is that it's entirely based on common sense. And the problem with the energy market is that it doesn't work on common sense, it works on vested interest. So yes, if we were to do exactly what you said, we would get exactly the information that we need, and if we worked in an energy market that was based on common sense, it would be changed because that was a sensible thing to do. But the way the processes work for actually implementing those changes is more based around where the interests lie. There's a lot of great ideas like that, which are what we've been sort of angling for a long time. But as a starting point, unless you've got $100,000 to spend on consultants, just getting the rule change proposal into a format that the AEMC will accept it is really challenging. So,
I mean, the whole exercise.
We've got three hands up there.
Oh, sorry.
Can we limit it to that and then move on to the next
I'm
one?
in your hands.
What?
So,
No. We're not going to close the door on anybody, but I sense that there are some who are beginning to tire. So if we could go through that and then extra questions at the end, gather around with Craig.
Sure.
It seems like this virtual net metering would be fine if I'm living in South Melbourne, it's the market. But surely in the longer term, that's going to be a bit of a killer blow for remote rural communities who have got no option but to, well, they'll be paying a much higher, over time, much higher transmission costs. And the second thing too, is this going to be a bit of a killer blow also for other emerging energy sources like concentrated solar thermal power stations, which arguably are going to be remotely positioned a long way from our demand sources, and therefore have relatively much higher transmission costs.
What you're talking about there is just an issue to do with proximity on the grid. I mean, that's nothing to do with the issue of virtual net metering per se.
Right.
Virtual net metering, though, for the reasons that you've identified, does work more effectively when you've got proximity. So the best example is probably not even South Melbourne Market one. It's where you're in an apartment block and everyone in the apartment block contributes to invest in, say, a 10 kilowatt solar array. And that gets its own meter. And so it'll be connected to the grid, and there'll be a row of meters. There'll be the meter for the solar array, there'll be 10 apartments, and there'll be a bus bar or something that they will connect on somewhere. And all the energy that comes out of the solar panels goes into the apartments directly via the meters. Yet the way the billing works assumes that all the energy that's coming to the apartments has come from the grid.
Yeah.
So in that case, it shouldn't have transmission or distribution charges. It should just have energy charges. The issue about which consumers it's going to work for based on distance, I wouldn't worry about consumers in remote areas and the cost of their energy, because yes, it costs a lot to serve those consumers with energy, but they don't pay for it. It gets smeared across all consumers. So if for example, you're on a SWIR line, a very remote line in power cores network on the end of the line, and it costs the network, $5,000 a year to keep you supplied with energy. Well, you're not paying for that energy. It's actually people in Ballarat who are paying just as much of it as you are because of the way the pricing works. So consumers in remote areas don't really lose out like that. They get cross-subsidised. But anything that they can save is a saving for everyone else.
And if they weren't cross-subsidised, then they may well move off the grid.
Well, there's a discussion for another night. And I propose that we do have that one, because we're doing some interesting work in that space as well, and there is a community interest in doing that too.
So we're assuming that all these 100 customers would be connected directly by wire, or are they just downstream of the substation?
It's not direct. So this sort of, both of those questions touch on something interesting, which is how proximate do they need to be. The idea is they're on the same network. Now, depending on the load and proximity, if you've got someone who's 100 metres away from the site and all the energy that they're getting from, and all the energy that comes out of a solar generator is used within 100 metres, then there's a strong argument for saying, well, the cost of the rest of the network is avoided. So we should only be responsible for the metering charges and the cost of maintaining that 100 metres of line and a few other, administration charges and so on.
So that'd be all downstream of the one substation?
Don't need to be downstream or upstream. If you think about how energy goes, even if the energy is going one way, it's energy that's being used at another site still avoids energy coming from somewhere else. Or energy that's generated at one location avoids energy coming from somewhere else. So it doesn't need to follow the electrons. It needs to follow a financial path that is relevant in terms of avoided costs.
So they charge for the distance, how far you are away.
Charging per distance would be a really good way to do virtual net metering. Yep. It's definitely not as simple as that, but that would be nothing in the energy market simple, and everything in the energy market gets simplified for the purpose of charges and stuff. So charging per distance would be one way of doing it.
Yeah, do any of these CREs, which are looking on the model where they say, we'll just put panels on your roof and pay for them and charge you directly as a small user, just like as if you owned the panel yourself? So lending the people money effectively, put the panel on, and when it was paid off, you said, okay, to
That's a really good point, actually, and I should have mentioned that earlier. So we've been talking about the energy sales side of it, the financing side of it, and I've deliberately avoided going into the bullet point of all 20 different possible permutations under the solar on the roof arrangement, but that's a very good example of one that some organisations are looking at. It's basically finance. It's saying, we'll lend you the money to put the panels up, and you can pay us back at a certain rate, and the cost benefit for the commercial industrial business might be that that is aligned with, that the finance is aligned with their savings on the bills. So, for example, if the business is saving $1,000 on their bills a month because of a solar array, then the repayments to the community organisation can be $1,000 a month, and everyone's a winner.
Well, so there are groups that have gone to all that?
Well, there's groups that are trying that model, yeah. Yep.
Because I'd be interested in knowing who they are.
So, off the top of my head, there's about half a dozen councils in Victoria that are looking at different models like this. And they're all at different stages. When I say councils, organisations that are council based on the local government area that are looking at doing this. And some aren't, they're not based on an LGA. Like, is Rangers based on an LGA area, or is it just people in the area?
In Victoria at the moment.
Yep. Often they do have Victoria-wide membership. To use the Hepburn example, sometimes they'll say if you're local, you can be treated a bit differently by having a lower cost of entry or whatever. But you know, they'll generally they're open to either geographically defined regions or sometimes interest groups. But I know Surf Coast, there's one in Surf Coast that's being developed. I think two of the councils in Victoria that have, one or two of the ones that have Aboriginal sounding names that I can't think of right now that start with M. Moreland Energy Foundation, MEFL, they're I think at the sort of consultation stage. There's a couple of other councils that I'm in discussion with that aren't at the stage of publicly discussing their what they want to do, but let's just say they're in the Melbourne metropolitan area. I know that Stonington Council have had a lot of interest in renewables, and I'm not sure if they've got anything going on this particular idea, but they might have. Who's the one down in Sorrento, Mornington, Shire Council? Again, we've done work with them on solar, and I think they've been amenable to the idea. So the councils are getting onto this because for them, often they have buildings that are large energy use buildings, and so they might be able to tick a couple of boxes in both being an energy user, supporting local community. One of the issues, of course, is giving, if you're if you're looking to use the selling energy model, then you need to have some certainty over the long-term energy use, and councils tend to be long-term residents at the sites that they occupy more reliably than commercial and industrial customers. So, because you don't want the risk that someone's going to move out in 3 years' time, leaving you with solar panels that aren't generating to a customer.
I was thinking more having just homeowners.
So financing homeowners
Yeah.
to well, there's a lot of financing arrangements out there at the moment for homeowners to buy solar panels, and a lot of them are charging usurial interest rates. We've compared a few of them, and some of them are no better than if you were to just put it on your credit card, which rates that high. So I'd say if there's a community organisation out there who's willing to actually charge some reasonable rates to consumers to finance solar panels on roofs at a residential level, I think there's a good community opening there for something that's a lot fairer than some of the financial institutions. Thanks, everyone.
Oh, sorry, no. Read to the next slide. Move on to the next slide.
No, next slide is that one. That's what we're doing. So I also had all this filler, see, but I don't think we want to get onto the filler. All this was about. I'm not even going to read these. I'll just put them up. In preparing this side, these slides, I actually, and knowing that I tend to crap on, I took some other slides from another presentation and thought I'll put them here just in case no one's got any questions. There it is. And they're basically some of the elements to the non-environmental incentives that people have for doing this stuff. But it's stuff that you people will understand anyway. You know, energy prices are going up. You know, there's a thirst for people who have their own stuff and get off grid. Technology is getting smarter, and that's meaning that a lot of the opportunities to do this stuff is now occurring. But actually, here's a point that I think is really worth making on the policy change, and it's the bottom point here. You know, we're consumer advocates. We're funded by the Consumer Advocacy Panel. Our focus is not on representing directly the hardest hit consumers, but we represent all consumers, and so we always take into account and prioritise the effective changes that we make. And this is why, if you read an ATA policy document on feed-in tariffs, you won't see us calling for 40-cent feed-in tariffs or anything like that now. You know, the day for new customers, those high premium feed-in tariffs is now well and truly over. We don't need them. The cost of solar has come down. What we do need is fair treatment of solar PV customers where they get cost-reflective values for what they can export. So, you know, a lot of the stuff that we're campaigning for, community renewable energy and everything, in everything we do, we're actually got a very solid message that we're not wanting to impose any costs on other consumers because that's regressive and that actually results in higher bills for families that are struggling who are already experiencing higher bills for a lot of other reasons. They're already getting higher bills because of inefficiencies in the system and so on. We don't want to make it worse. Unfortunately, we don't have, and I mean that's a message that we really try and hammer out there. Unfortunately, it's not a message that gets out there obviously because there's a strong wedge that gets driven between the environmental interests and the interest of low-income households. And it's one that we're actively trying to overcome. So, you know, it's just a point that we always make. We don't want to introduce cross-subsidies that aren't already there. We do want to get rid of cross-subsidy of all types where we can. And, you know, most importantly, we don't want to drive bills up for people who are already experiencing higher bills. And that's why I think we've got a lot of common interest with low-income groups, and we work very closely with them because things like energy efficiency, it's a no-brainer. You know, you can save money for people who are struggling to pay bills at the same time as improving environmental outcomes.
How big a threat is CRE to the incumbents at the moment?
It's more of an inconvenience. It's a bit of a threat to their model because if it takes off, if 10% of consumers are generating their own energy to some extent, then there's 10% less in the market for wholesale energy production.
Time to get rid of coal-fired power stations.
Surely they're looking at Germany where 20% is renewables now, and that's really taken all the cream off their profits. So, you know, that's happening here. So,
I'm like closing down coal generation.
Well, in a lot of, yeah, I mean, it's never simple. A lot of the investment that's been made in the energy market has been made under promises of, well, firstly, a lot of it's been made by governments, and a lot of it's been made under promises of regulated returns. And a lot of those things are now trying to be protected by those businesses. I mean, some of the things they're doing that will make community renewable energy hard are the same things that they're doing that will make going off grid difficult. They'll try and introduce, they'll try and bring in fixed fees to, they'll have more of the energy bills focused on fixed fees amounts. Now what that means is that energy that's generated or saved on site has a relatively lower value because it has less effect of reducing your bill. If half of your bill is in fixed fees, and the volume charge drops as a result, then reducing the volume of energy consumption doesn't make so much difference. Generating on site doesn't make so much difference. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's, there's vested interests have got a lot of vested interests.
So the more they put the price up, the more we want to stop using it.
Yeah, that's true.
Other things we can learn from overseas.
Oh, there's so much that we can learn from overseas. Personally, I think if we welcomed asylum seekers to our shore and gave them a place to stay, we'd be able to learn to be hospitable and not be treated as, the global idiots. But, that's just a personal view of that. In terms of energy, I think we can learn a lot from overseas in terms of efficiency of networks. We can learn from, California, who have embraced renewable energies and demand response and made mistakes in the market and gone and fixed them up. The thing about our energy market is they don't seem to be scared of making mistakes. They just seem to be scared of making the mistakes that would potentially benefit consumers. And what could we learn? Well, we could learn that some things need to be tried to see if they're going to succeed or not. And when they do succeed, you can go to the next step and build on them. And that's something that's really missing in our market. And that's where things like community renewable energy projects are a really good example of how you can try things, and with a bit of lenience from the institutions, we can see if something works and see where the holes in it are, and then fix it and make it more broadly applicable.
You said a magic word then, that last sentence included the word community. Could I ask our guests to help close this, our guest from Mount Alexander, for his opinion on this meeting? Was this meeting useful to you? Could you give us a presentation yourselves in a few months to put beside this? From the practical point of view, with your experience, where are we?
Well, I'll answer that. Yes, I found it useful because a lot of that's applicable to solar and wind. And while we've called ourselves MacWind, we are also engaged with the community on solar projects, something we're quite interested in coming up tonight. One of the slides you put up earlier, which I thought we have probably got a bit of experience we could share with you, is on funding in the early stages, because we don't have the $1.5 million that Hepburn Wind got from government. So we've been reliant on philanthropic funding to date, and that hasn't been easy. And in pro bono, yes, we've had a lot of pro bono services offered by people in the industry, which has been fantastic. But we've reached a stage where we would need more significant funding in the next phases, and it's not available philanthropically. Because we will transition to a profit-earning organisation, we're automatically excluded from some of the big funders. So what we're doing is we're working on setting up an entity outside the sustainability group, which can seek angel investors. And so come early next year, we anticipate we'll be seeking angel investors as a source of funding, where they accept a high risk, but ultimately they do expect a return. Yep. And we think that that's the only way we can do it, because the philanthropic funding is not really available.
My personal view, and I've specialised in all sorts of wind energy for a number of years. The way you develop wind energy projects is one of the best examples of how you manage risk of just about any type of project. In the early stages of site finding, to identifying what you want from the physical attributes of the site, the wind resource, the grid connection capacity, how much you expect to pay for energy, what your investor returns are meant to be. And that's before you even get into the whole community side of it, which will have its own nuances in relation to all of those areas. And my personal view is that from being involved on the periphery of a few of those big projects, generally the skills that are available in a community and the skills that are available pro bono, can get those projects to a point where you've got enough of an idea that you can choose which ones you're going to take to that next development stage where you invest in wind monitoring, where you invest in consultants doing the environmental assessments where you need to. Most importantly, and usually most ignored, investing in the grid capacity assessments, grid connection assessments, and starting that process that's required. I personally think that you can get to that point in a way that will allow you to, maybe not as an individual community, but across a range of community projects of that type, be able to say, okay, well, here's 10 potential sites. If an angel investor wants to diversify their risk and be assured of a, of a return, if they were to invest in those 10 potential sites, they could be pretty much guaranteed of it. Because, half of them will fail. That's how wind goes. If you're lucky, it'll only be half will fail. But the returns, once you've got to that stage, compared to how much you need to invest to do the wind monitoring and do those other things on a per site basis, should be enough to make it work. That's my view, having seen that from the commercial side and seen it from the sort of technical and expert on the wind side and from the community side as well. But it's hard to convince institutional investors to do that. But as you'd be aware, there's a few around who are entertaining the idea. See there, the biggest barrier I have to present them with the diversified portfolio as opposed to just 2 or 3 sites.
And not just wind, but the hybrid energy. Solutions. Which every community has potential.
Absolutely. Ditto for solar. Solar is much easier to diversify, I think, and it's much lower development cost as well, because it's much easier to do your feasibility assessment for solar. That's basically the issue with wind, is the feasibility assessment for wind resource, grid connection, cost, and all those things is a long, arduous process.